Welcome to Chapter 12 on Liberation Theologies. So you'll notice in this chapter it's going to be a little bit different than some of the other ones where we're looking at pure ideologies. So that being said, let's go ahead and get into, well, what exactly is the difference here between a theology and an ideology, right? As words in some ways look almost identical except for the very beginning there. So theology, you can see here again, has that religious aspect to it. So here's just a definition that I pulled for you. The field of study and analysis that treats of God and of God's attributes in relation to the universe. Or probably the one that's most important maybe for our purposes as far as this chapter would be just the study of divine things, or more importantly, religious truth. So again, what do certain groups or certain people believe is religious truth? And then of course divinity sort of is attached to that. So that's theology. Whereas on the other hand, ideology, which we've been looking at, of course, in all the other chapters, is this value system or belief system accepted as fact or truth by some group. So remember, there's all those other attributes with ideologies as well, as far as being mutually reinforcing, for example, where ideologies pull things in that they support or accept, and then push things away that, of course, they don't believe in and do not accept. So I have a link here, again, thinking about the differences between these two, going back all the way towards the beginning of the course, where I have in here where we watched a speech from a former Senator Rick Santorum. So if you click on that, we have, you'll see this video come up here from the show CBS, right? So from CBS this morning here, where it says Santorum remark on Obama theology draws ire. So they sort of talk about in there, did he just sort of get the words wrong? What did he mean by theology and so forth? So again, I think in this instance he did, right? So he was talking about sort of what President Obama, Obama believed in at the time, without really, he didn't mean that his religion was false, something like that. He was talking more about climate change, that type of thing. Okay, so I would encourage you to sort of watch that again. I think they do a good job sort of talking about the differences between those two. All right, so continuing on here, just like in the other chapters, we have some sort of key aspects or important parts that we think of with liberation theology. So interesting theories actually began as a movement within the Catholic Church, even though part of what we'll see this chapter is that the Catholic Church hierarchy, particularly those that often at the very top of it, have often moved away from liberation theology or have outright rejected it. So it's interesting to see that something that began in one institution in many respects is not supported by that same institution. So you can see here it began in Latin America, predominantly Spanish-speaking areas there, and it really concentrates on this central role of the poor and the oppressed, right? So again, kind of that liberation idea, freedom, sort of pulling people up from their sort of poor station in life. So even though it started as a movement within the Catholic Church, it's now found in most Christian denominations. And as your book makes a good argument there, I think that in many ways it's moved from the Catholic Church more towards different Protestant denominations. So in particularly a lot of the rest of the world, as we'll see later in the chapter, say in Africa or in Asia, for example, really see liberation theology being more recognizable in Protestantism than we do in Catholicism. So another key piece here is it argues for committed action. So again, more of an active approach as compared to just a passive. So instead of just sitting back, seeing what happens, they really want, direct action to try to reach that liberation. Again, the central role of the poor and the oppressed. And with that, so it's also sort of a political movement. Again, that there's this idea that people should be active in trying to get this sort of liberation here. All right. So continuing on here, some different aspects of liberation theology wanted to continue on with. So like some of the other things that we've looked at in the course, the first stage is just to recognize the oppression, because sometimes people might have been born and raised into a certain situation, and maybe they don't even know any different. They have no real conception that maybe things could actually be otherwise. So sometimes it's important for them to totally, to get a good understanding of just what that oppression means, and maybe how their life is different than it otherwise could be. So in large part, this liberation theology is just a general critique of the sort of power relationships or that current power social structure. So again, comparable to feminism or some of those other ideologies where that are also focused on power relationships and structure. There's this focus on who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor, because that's going to be important for recognizing that oppression and then perhaps doing something about it. So a core belief here of liberation theology is this idea of Jesus not only as a savior, but also as liberator, where he is bringing the good news of liberation. So, not just a religious figure, but almost more of like a just sort of like a pulling up the poor from their status in life. So part of as related to that is this idea of creating the kingdom of God here on earth. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things interesting to look at with liberation theology is how it's been handled by the higher church hierarchy. So you can't get any higher than the papacy, right? Which is the position of the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, and who Catholics believe is the embodiment of Christ on earth, right? So again, you can't get any higher than that. So we've seen here, as you can see, it's often been an opposition from this church hierarchy to liberation theology. So you can see this Pope, John Paul II, he was in the papacy for quite a long time, until his death in 2005, right? So, many decades in the papacy here. So more of a sort of conservative view towards the church's role in society, and he was not a huge proponent of liberation theology. His successor, Pope Benedict XVI, was even more sort of against the teachings of liberation theology, and he was heavily involved in what we call the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. So this is a group that's heavily involved with actually, writing what are the key documents for the Catholic Church, what should be the main teachings, what should be taught, what are the different church positions, those type of things. So if we pull this in here, so again, you can see Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So you can see here Doctrina Fidei.va, right? So .va is the Vatican over in Italy. Just like other countries, say for example Germany, is .de, for example, or United Kingdom would be .uk. The Vatican has the .va. So again, you can see on their website they have all these different doctrines of doctrinal documents, disciplinary documents, sacramental questions. So all these type of things, and in many respects, they were against some of those teachings. So then most recently, in 2013, we had an interesting situation where I think partly due to some of the extreme challenges that the church was facing related to sexual abuse and just some other sort of financial improprieties and things, Pope Benedict XVI decided to step down as Pope, which had not happened for, I believe, for about 700 years. That only has happened one other time. Because, again, to sort of think about it, if the Pope is the embodiment of Christ on earth, then it seems a little problematic to sort of have two that would be alive at the same time. So he is still alive. He's a very elderly gentleman at this point, but he's still there. So, but when he stepped down, that led to the appointment of Pope Francis I, and he is currently in the papacy. Now, again, you'll see here there's another article related to him that I have in here that you might use for one of your paper topics. So I would encourage you, though, to look at this website as well. If you click on that link, this is from the night that he was installed as the Pope there. So again, Pope Francis I obviously isn't his real name. So you can see here his name is Jorge Bergoglio. He is actually from Argentina. So again, if you think about the relationship to liberation theology, he is from that neck of the woods where all of that got started, right? In Latin America, Spanish speaking, that type of thing. So I encourage you to check out this video, and you can see there's an article accompanying that as well. So again, you see, when he became into the papacy in 2013, he was already 76 years old, but compared to Benedict XVI, he's quite a bit younger. But that being said, it's not like we usually see, we don't see young men being appointed to the papacy. Okay. All right. So then, related to liberation theology, there's also this sort of distinction of, or maybe this tension between the developed and the developing world. So we think about, again, opposition from church hierarchy. Of course, that's going to be centered more in the developed. So developed is sort of another way of saying that you're richer countries or advanced industrialized countries. So, for example, Canada, United States, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, and so on. Or the developing world are those countries that are still developing economically. So there can be a huge range of those. And then often we refer to the poorest of the poor countries as the least developed countries, or LDCs. So returning to this, so if the hierarchy is in the developed world, then people sort of say, well, isn't that sort of you can see that tension there where liberation theology is often centered in much of the developing world. Again, Africa, Asia, Latin America, places like that. So it's not just a question of maybe money, right? Finances and economic advancement, that type of thing, but has a lot to do with geography, location, all these type of things. So again, developed world related to the Catholic Church would obviously be centered in Europe, so maybe there's somewhat of a tension there as well. And I think your book does a pretty good job explaining some of those things as well. So as I mentioned earlier, liberation theology in the world today is most dynamic more in Protestantism than in Catholicism, even though it started in the latter there. So two of the regions where we really see it has gained a lot of steam is in Africa and Asia, right, where there obviously is a lot of poor people, where liberation theology might have more of a draw to it than in much of the richer world. And even in the United States, of course, although the United States is considered a rich country and is the highest GDP in the world, there are still a lot of poor folks in the United States, right? A lot of people that feel oppressed, where maybe we have more of an equality gap here in the United States than other countries, say in Europe, for example. So you can see why liberation theology would also be appealing to many people here in the United States. So some other aspects here. So kind of combining another ideology we looked at in the course. So there's feminist liberation theology, right? So again, would be focused on the preferential option for the poor and the oppressed, but then also looking at the central role of women. So kind of connecting women and women's rights, feminism, to that liberation theology. So in the last part on this slide here, so there's been a bit of coordination, in recent decades related to liberation theology. So you can see there's this group known as EATWAT, the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians. So if you remember from the previous slide, we were talking about developing countries. Developing is just sort of a newer word for third world. Again, poor countries used to be referred to as third world, but that's changed a little bit. So same kind of idea, countries that are sort of on their way towards greater economic status. So we'll go ahead and stop this first video here, and we'll continue on in the next slide in the second video.